For inviting me. Thank you so much. I thank Helen Appel for making her patience in dealing with me and with making the visit possible. And I would like to thank the Sangha and the Upasikas and Upasikas of the Nritya Mandala Mahavihara and their friends for being here today, all of you. Thank you all and to all involved in making this possible for me. I should add that I'm going to speak today about a little project which was made possible by my Canadian colleague Vanessa Sasson, who asked me to contribute towards a volume she's preparing on jewels in Buddhism. So if all goes well, you'll be able to read this little talk I've brought with me as a book, or in a book, to be published by Hawaii University Press sometime next year. And I can think of no better gift, I thought, to the Vihara, celebrating its 10th anniversary under the motto, a mandala of gems, than to invoke in my presentation the gems that Nevas and Buddhist Nevas handle and admire to celebrate their Buddhism. So, Bhintuna, congratulations to Prajolju, accompanied by my humble request to accept this little Ratnanjali, little offering of gems. My lecture is driven by the question of what role jewels play in how people relate to each other. More precisely, I ask myself how jewels, on the basis of the difference between those who display them and those who take note, how jewels help create the difference between the desired and the desiring. The most obvious domains this difference plays out are in the relations among women and men, human and superhuman, and between classes or castes, shaping how members of specific gender or status groups understand themselves and relate within the groups they find themselves in through jewels. That involves looking at jewels, at least in a first step, as a commodity, and at the market conditions under which they are produced, owned and circulated. It further also requires looking at the way jewels figure in literary discourse that has shaped historically enduring ways of understanding the implications of the deployment and enjoyment of jewels, and creating and reconfirming what jewels are meant to and happen to do. Buddhism, and more specifically the Buddhism of the Nevas of Nepal, appears to be a particularly productive field, I think, for asking these questions for two main reasons. Firstly, the Neva jewelry market has been dominated over the last centuries by members of castes self-identifying as Buddhist, which means that Buddhist or not, Nevas have to deal with Buddhists when they deal with jewels. Further, those Buddhists understand themselves as being in charge of the Neva jewelry business, just as they take pride in being the largest manufacturers and exporters of religious artifacts in Nepal. These Buddhist Neva groups are well aware of the significance of jewels for caste and class differences and of the influence of Buddhist material culture on Nepalese society. It hence behooves us to trace jewels into territory that may not be specifically Buddhist, but allows for the Buddhist and non-Buddhist to illuminate each other to help us understand how jewels work. Secondly, Buddhism is well known for having a particular interest in the relation between the householder status involving possession and the monastic status involving renunciation. The acquiring of riches, including jewels, is celebrated just as much as their rejection, and the way in which the two are balanced or made to remain at odds with each other is something Buddhist communities have articulated throughout their history. Today I will try to address all these three steps by elaborating first on the fashioning, then on the singing, and finally on the narrating of jewels. I will not talk about the dancing with jewels, but I leave that to the specialist. Being a goldsmith was, at least until the last century, the dominant occupation of Vajracharya and Shakya men. Vajracharyas are members of the priestly caste associated with conducting the fire sacrifice and with shrines that involve tantric worship. Shakya serve more generally as guardians and curators of most major traditional Neva monasteries. It has been men, not women, who work on the primary materials and their fashioning. Traditionally, and to a great extent till today, women are, if at all, involved in the sale. Goldsmithing has been their dominant, these castes, the dominant economic activity of these castes, both in the cities, but also outside the urban centers. Involvement in the jewelry tisa business has remained almost as strong an identity marker of these two caste communities as Buddhism. The history of an influential Shakya clan, the Dakwas, is said to go back to a Neva goldsmith who spent only half of the money, which came in through Tibetan donations in gold, he received for a lama's throne, and used the other half to start a textile retail business, thus laying the foundation for the family's fortune. A well-known Vajracharya, Dunda Bahadur, can to this day be found sitting behind the counter of his precious metal shop in Lalitpur, just across the street from the impressive Buddhist studies private library he has built, chipping away at his lifetime's work, the translation of the entire Theravada canon into Neva. On the whole, however, with the general decline of the small goldsmith business due to rising gold prices and other changes in the sector worldwide, lines of business have increasingly shifted towards tourist curio production and sales, which include less jewelry than images and tourist souvenirs. The Vajracharyas and the Shakyas' traditional handling of precious metals and their occupation as jewelry makers has been associated, especially among non-Buddhist Nevas, with a relatively low caste status, which such occupational castes share with those in the non-Nevar, Parbatiya communities. While Buddhist Nevas traditionally tend to put the blame on the local legendary version of Shankaracharya, for Vajracharyas and Shakyas, David Gellner assumes that the perception of goldsmithing as low-caste activity may be an effect of the Nevas taking over views dominant among non-Neva groups, where we find a much less clearly differentiated caste system in which a much vaster range of occupations is regarded as low caste. That stands in contrast both with the high caste status which Vajracharyas and Shakyas enjoy within the traditional Neva Buddhist caste hierarchy, and with the general respect Neva society has towards artisans. Scholars have also remarked on the internal hierarchies that exist among the Neva artisan castes themselves, depending on their primary resources, which form part of the set of 8 substances, ashtadhatu, or metals: gold, silver, copper, lead, mercury, zinc, iron, and tin. Here the Vajracharyas rank highest due to their handling of gold, lum, associated with the sun. The Shakyas second with silver, vaha, associated with the moon. A part diverging hierarchy of metals is reflected by the body parts on which they may be worn. Gold only as low as the fingers, copper only down to the waist, and silver down to the feet, with silver being good for walking. A somehow different list, reflecting a similar hierarchy, but more comprehensively dealing with the division of labor in the fabrication of jewelry, mentions first the Shakya as the gold or silver smith, the jeweler, Jwari, often from the Shrestha or Manandar castes, the blacksmith, Kau, working with iron, the copper and brass worker, Tamo, the tailor, Suika, and finally the artisan working with molten glass, with glass pearls and with cotton and silk threads, identified by his religious identity, the Musma, the Muslim. What these lists make clear is that making jewelry is a joint project. As Bruce McCoy Owens has shown regarding the procession of Bungadya, or the Red Matsyendranath, and as Niels Gutschow, another anthropologist, and Axel Michaels, an Indologist, have shown for Neva life crisis rituals, individuals from different castes and of unequal social status need to come together to create these events. Just like Neva rituals, Neva jewelry encapsulates in the process of its production Neva society as a whole, and refers back to its diversity, its inequality, and the insistence on the complementarity of its social order. Structurally, the roles cover the manufacturing of the various settings, the filaments joining, if necessary, their parts, the more or less precious inlays, and always at the final stage, the work in gold or silver. Just as the Vajracharya is the main officiating priest, the Mool Purohit, in a rite, it is the Buddhist goldsmith who stands, or rather sits, at the end of this lineup and completes the event of beauty that the wearing of a piece of jewelry is meant to be, by adding the metalwork and fashioning the piece into a consummate whole. The special position held by the goldsmith is further highlighted by the fact that his responsibilities do not end with handing over the merchandise to the customer. For a child's first rice feeding, called Macha Jango, or Sanskrit Annaprashana, at 5 or 6 months of age, he is asked to pierce the child's earlobes, the goldsmith, ahead of the ritual event. Now it is often in his shop, and is then called into the family home, bringing together with his pincers the earrings which he twists into the infant's pierced ears, as well as the pair of heavy anklets called kalli he or she has to wear for the first time on that occasion. And once the child, if she is a girl, is grown up and gets married, it's usually the same goldsmith who manufactures and slips on the golden bracelets she gets to show off as a bride. The goldsmith not only helps individuals to achieve relative ritual seniority, he also, in his role of facilitating the extensive wedding gifts that are involved as part of the exchanges, dowry related or not, helps to ritually create alliances between families. This speaks of the intimate relationship the goldsmith, traditionally a neighbor, has with the families he services. Just as every neighbor family has their priest who accompanies them through their domestic cycles of annual, life cycle, and occasional rites, and whose own family and priestly lineage is usually tied to the patron family over generations, so the goldsmith not only supplies the family with his artifact, but is also well aware of all the key events and social changes marked by rites in which his services are required. On these occasions, he is allowed into the homes of his clients, but more than that, similar to the priest and to the range of para-priests to which one could easily add him, the jeweler has the most direct access to the bodies and the well-being of his clients. The goldsmith, as we have seen on certain occasions himself, attaches the artifacts to ears, arms, and legs. What he has wrought with his own hands is what makes his clients look their best, represents their status, celebrates their bodies and their auspiciousness and prestige on key occasions in their life. His work is in constant contact with their bodies, most of their waking and much of their sleeping time, and has become one with their skin and flesh more than almost any other service or artifact in the Nepal world. Jewelry forms a substantial part of any Nepal's family capital. The stakes are high, and with them the fear that one may be taken for a ride. It thus comes as no surprise that among the Nepals these fears have taken the shape of stereotyping and derogatory adages that warn about the greedy and treacherous goldsmith. The Bare sells, Bare another word for a high caste, Nepalese Buddhists, the Bare sells lead at the price of gold. Bare lisana lunyana mi. Or, the Bare loses sleep over failing to steal the gold even from his mother's jewelry. Manya tisan lu kuyake machine barea nya mawa. The South Asian traditional male-oriented proverb culture also has the female family members, thanks to the expenses they demand in ornaments run up, foolishly supply with food somebody who is neither her husband nor her children. Quote, a woman's jewelry is the Bare's food. Misaya tisa bareya nasa. Because of the perceived inevitability of the family's fortune bleeding into the pocket of the goldsmith, in this relationship, trust is of essence. This implies that the goldsmith is also keenly aware of the economic fortunes of the family he is tied to. He knows how much his patrons can and are likely to spend at which point in time. He is also the one who pawns or buys family jewelry when his patrons go through rough patches, and is expected to do so discreetly. The first bank in Kathmandu, in the Kathmandu Valley, and in Nepal, the Nepal Bank Limited, opened only in 1937, and life insurances began to be offered a good 30 years later. This means that right until the middle of the 20th century, among the Nepals, as among most other communities in South Asia, before that, and in some right until the present day, the jewelry that women wore on their bodies functioned as the family's most readily divestible asset, and the Buddhist goldsmith as their personal banker. Another responsibility of the goldsmith that adds to his profile as a para-priest is his is his expertise regarding gems, ratna in Sanskrit. As we have seen, while the jewelry may sell them, the jeweler may sell them, the Bare is the one who integrates them into his work, deciding which particular jewels of which size and shape are needed for which item, on which occasion, for which person, and, if more than one jewel is required, in which combination. As mentioned above, each gem is affiliated with a specific celestial, actually I didn't mention that, with a specific celestial deity, Sanskrit graha, and its specific powers, from which the wearer profits. These powers range from protecting against physical illnesses, such as the ruby or gold bringing health, happiness, and prosperity, and protecting against blame, or the white pearl, strengthening one's memory and facilitating childbirth, or the emerald, doing very similar things. The particularly powerful piece of jewelry that includes all 9 gems, the Navaratna, requires the arrangement of the individual stones in a prescribed fashion, with the ruby or the piece of gold at the center, then proceeding down the list, starting in the east, continuing clockwise around the ruby with coral, garnet, sapphire, lapislazuli, topaz, emerald, diamond on the top, and ending with a pearl. And other rules concerning the stone's size, color, and conjoining metals. The main gem a person should wear is the birth gem, the Janmaratna, or astrological stone, Rasi Ratna, that depends on that person's ruling celestial deity, the Swamigraha. Thus, all jewelry involving gems requires a mediation not only of a host of artisans by the goldsmith, but also of the two para-priests' work by the client, astrologers and goldsmiths. Both have the knowledge to prescribe certain kinds of jewelry, including semi-precious stones, to serve specific purposes in life. For example, a client who worries about a trip is recommended to have a ring with a pearl and another with moonstone, made to appease the moon deity who clears the way. An elderly client may be advised to commission a ring with a turquoise, yew, to keep her or him from feeling stiff or cold. Though jewelry remains a gender and age marker, even outside those contexts of heightened attention and expenditure, the largest visibility the Buddhist Neva goldsmith work has today is during the deployment of traditional Neva jewelry on the occasion of the celebration of life crisis rituals, when Nevas experience belonging and perform Nevarness. In fact, these events are the only occasions in which most of the jewelry, known or forgotten among the Nevas today, still is or has been traditionally worn. As most of this jewelry has to be understood as forming an array of ritual implements, the degree to which the handling and understanding of this jewelry is still alive depends to a great deal on how much the performers today decide to include these implements in the life crisis rites they organize. Jewelry as mark of ritual seniority through a lifespan thus is mainly applied and displayed on the occasion of these very events, and not, as popular depictions in song and video culture may suggest, in everyday usage. It also needs to be noted that there is an acute awareness of what has come to be seen as an endangered tradition of doing things the Neva way. This anxiety has deep roots in Neva religious resistance to the monarchy and the Neva language nationalism movement, both dating back to the early 20th century. There's a widespread complaint that jewelry deemed traditional and originally Nevar is seen less and less in public, less manufactured, less sold, and even more rarely worn and displayed. Observers note a general tendency to wear smaller, lighter, cheaper jewelry with less gold or gold-plated and with fewer to no stones. One trend is to break up single larger pieces to have smaller ones made out of the materials. Another is to go for jewelry imported from India, particularly Bengal, and to have jewelry designed following models from south of the border. While this is lamented by some and can be argued to be a weakening of the traditional hold by women on this specific form of the capital, of the family, anthropologist Joran Jacobson reminds us that at the same time these new developments may be, quote, indicative of a potential increase in women's overall economic power, end quote. Like in the case of ritual culture or the artistic and architectural heritage, these developments and perceptions have led, in the field of Neva jewelry, to an increased interest in documentation and preservation, on the one hand, and practices of celebration and revival on the other. Publications by people like Sushila Manandar and Muti Lakshmi Shakya are an expression of this trend. Muti Lakshmi's book title even stresses that the jewelry is ours, Jigutisa, meaning the Nevas, or more specifically belonging to high-status Buddhist Neva castes who have their own claims to represent the Pan-Neva Gemeinschaft. Efforts made since the 1980s by the Hastakala Pravardhan Shaka, a government department dedicated to artisanal industries, to document and promote technologies for the production of traditional jewelry, including those identified as Neva, are driven by concerns that are similar with the ethnic at the service of the national. A similar self-folklorization occurs in the nostalgic celebration of Neva material culture in films and music videos, with female models bedazzling in stage versions of the real things. These musical productions transport and recreate a song culture in which, as we shall see in a moment, jewelry plays a central role, in the articulation of desire, in this case for the traditional and for the self-identical. It is difficult to say how much of the current handling of jewelry associated with Nevarness carries on old practices or betrays an attention to and stress on jewelry that is new. This takes us full circle from the production via the divestment to the reappreciation of jewelry among Neva Buddhists. An ideal place to look for that is the rich lyrical culture, which, as with jewelry, is both a fragile and endangered resource, and a bastion of nostalgic, re-traditionalizing discourse that may tell us as much about a disappearing culture as about a reinvented world of material culture and sexual difference. Jewelry plays a key role in what is arguably the most popular Nepalese song, Rajamati, famous from the first time we know of it, that it was sung during Prime Minister Jang Bahadur Rana's visit to London in 1850, until today, on occasions when Nepali and particularly Neva folklore are celebrated. The song, Rajamati, is written in almost rudimentary Neva, bordering on what maybe have been a 19th century slang, and as one may expect from folkloric material, dealing with the marketability of women in the eyes of men, comes with a generous helping of objectifying and demeaning language. Here are the lyrics in full. I'm not going to sing this, just recite a couple of verses here. Rajamati kumati, jike wasa pirati, haya baba rajamati cha. I'll give you the English translation of the full, well, not the full, but part of it. Crazy Rajamati. If she comes to me, love. Kuchiku Rajamati baby. If I don't get Rajamati, I'm going to go to Benares. Oh, daddy, get me Rajamati baby. Curly, swirly hair, bedroom eyes, a Sanku chick, right? Face, white. Face with 2 spots. Tahanani's Rajamati baby. Eggshells in the cranny, beaten rice dust from a shop. Rajamati is a mess. Where is Rajamati? There's one in Itumbaha. Get me Rajamati baby. Walking in front is big bossy pants. Walking behind is little bossy pants. After her goes Rajamati baby. I don't care for big bossy pants. Couldn't care less about little bossy pants. Get me married to Rajamati. Big bossy pants now. Attention, now comes the jewelry. Big bossy pants got a tayo. Little bossy pants got payos. Rajamati baby got bijakanis. I don't want a wife without bijakanis. Oh daddy, get me Rajamati baby. Talhiti is uptown. Kohiti is downtown. Maruhiti is halfway. While fetching water at Maruhiti, she tripped on a broad stone and Rajamati slammed flat on her back. Dress her up in jewelry. Let the Gujaratis play. Get me married to Rajamati. If you get me Rajamati, I will not go to Benares. Oh daddy, get me Rajamati baby. It is the jewelry mentioned in verse 5 that makes Rajamati particular and particularly attractive to the male singer. The other girls too are wearing jewelry. A tayo worn by big bossy pants is an oblong metal pendant with pointed ends that hangs horizontally on the person's breast and may include an image of a protective deity, most often the Buddhist deity Harati. It is part of an array of jewelry deployed to ward off diseases, the evil eye, or any kind of demonic attacks, similar to the pendants known as jantar, some of them worn as early as in infancy. Anklets, of which the payos, worn by little bossy pants, are one kind, bear a similar protective function and are worn by girl children from early childhood on. Tayo and payos may be all right. Bijakanis or ear cuffs, though, are way better. They point ahead to the type of jewelry worn at a wedding. The prospective bride always carries in part of what the son anticipates she will comprehensively be showered in during the celebration of his family's economic prowess, to complete with the sound of flutes imported from Gujarat and in the fulfillment of his wish. Referencing the Hindu wedding rite in which the groom ritually threatens to leave for Benares only after having his father ritually change his mind and getting him married to the bride, the son says it is either all or nothing, either the ear cuff wearing Rajamati or renunciation in far-off land. The dominant feature of the song, being an address of one male to another, the son to the father, is in line with a certain aesthetic of South Asian love discourse. The transgressive male, here embodied by the son, demanding from the withholding male, the father, to agree to a love marriage. As the centrality of the bejeweled object of desire in the song seems to suggest, there is no poetic beauty without the poeticized jewel. And it is the jewel that makes the boy, so to speak, lose his marbles. The demonstrative promise of the sun craving to cover Rajamati in jewelry can also be found reversed, such as in another first-person perspective song, in which the unfortunate Sintali complains that her lover, who, quote, has been gone for a while, said, "I will have you wear tayos and tukis," end quote. A song which the singer claims to know all about marriage and women, in which he sententiously proclaims that, once married, quote, "her arms and legs will be covered, friend," end quote. That they will be covered with nothing less than jewelry is self-understood. Jewelry is seen as tying women to men in the commitment that beauty is meant to seal, as female voices themselves are made to demand commitment in terms of the nuptial deployment of jewelry. Quote, "One string of tiny magatya, 2 strings of flower plate jewelry, color me red, lift the palanquin, send me off," end quote. Inversely, Neva's song also imagines female desire for the jewel-bestowing patron, such as mid-20th century lyrics in which the female first-person singer dismissively demands, quote, "You better give me 1 red ring, Mr. Cad," translating Gunda Daju. So you better give me 1 red ring, Mr. Cad. And continuing in heavy jewel talk, she says, "If you, Mr. Cad, give me a tayo and 2 tuchikas, my ears will be lined with mundris." The mundra or mundri being a large looped earring. In the woman's formidable demand fantasized by the male poet, we encounter the crescendo of jewelry items already noted in Rajamati, leading from the modest piece dangling over her breast and tied around the neck, right up the pieces adorning her ears. Only here the ear is literally lined with cuffs and is the woman who is made to predict an almost miraculous climactic serialization with multiplication almost magically bursting forth from those 1-2 little bijoux she demands. While jewelry is the embodiment of the desiring singer's infatuation, it can also be turned by a man into the curse of the rejected to resemble something close to what today would be termed slut-shaming. The male singer holds it against the woman who rejected him that she beautified herself in the first place. As the refrain of a certain other song goes, he got, quote, "courted and carried away," end quote, due to, and here the singer addresses her directly, quote, "the anklets on your feet, the golden bracelets on the arms, and when you flash your ring," end quote. It is the reductive identification of women and jewelry which stands at the core of this poetics. But just as the song seems to absorb the woman into her jewelry, so jewelry also seems to be the way for the poet to project himself into the most intimate realms of female space. The serenaded female figure failing to make it to the window, to expose herself to the appropriating male gaze of the singer, is said to be close to wearing out the chunky coral beads she's wearing. Quote, "Your big bimpus are half gone, precious lady. Don't you need to come out?" End quote. The Neva scholar Siegfried Lienhardt, probably relying on an oral commentary, tries to solve the puzzle, "Your big bimpus are half gone, precious lady, don't you need to come out?" Tries to solve the puzzle by suggesting, quote, "Since the girl wears her corals even when sleeping, these ornaments have become worn out," end quote. This poetic intrusion into the girl's bedroom could be understood as trying to evoke the eroticism of the languid, evoking the frisson of coral for days on end, relentlessly pushing against sheets. Wasting away is also a common South Asian poetic motive, either a physical sign of the prolonged separation of lovers or the hallmark of impermanence. With the big bimpus likely to be the jewelry talk version of the woman's breasts, the poet may be suggesting that she is either secretly pining for him and wasting away what is meant to be enjoyed, or foolishly saving herself up as age inexorably cuts into her assets. In a 19th century poem composed by the scholar Amartananda, Buddha Shakyamuni himself is the jewel, not the ratna as in a triple gem, but Sanskrit, but the mani of his lineage, Shakyakulaya, rhyming on the verse that calls him the Lord of the 3 worlds. Another identification of the sacred with the jewel is the Neva designation of their 9 most revered books, the 9 dharmas, the Navadharma. 9 books, or 9 sutras, as the 9 gems, Navaratna, which appear in rituals that include the worship of the triple gem in the form of a mandala splayed out on the floor of the ritual arena. The set of 9 making up the Dharma gem, Dharmaratna. The parallelism to one of the most prized, powerful, and popular ornaments in South and Southeast Asia, the 9-gemmed, gold-framed composite piece of jewelry called the Navaratna, mentioned earlier, is not accidental. In an 18th century song, the Buddha Shakyamuni, apart from being one of the triple gems, also wears jewels, particularly and not surprisingly for us at this point, on his ears. Quote, "Your ears are bedecked with many jewels, your ears shine twice as brightly as the sun," end quote. The Neva deity of Mount Chobala, called Chowa or Lokeshwaram, who on his, quote, body, the color of dawn, wears a garland of diamonds and pearls, Arunaya, Barna Vasa, Hiramoti, Mala, Masa, and whose body radiates effulgence. Addressing the even more famous Neva deity Bungadyo, the protagonist of the largest festival of the Kathmandu Valley, another poet compares the extraordinary beauty of the face of the bright red processional image, first again with that of dawn, then as being, quote, equal to the golden tika applied to the forehead that resembles the sun, end quote. The jewels added to the beautiful god in the following verse, quote, bedecked with jewelry containing various gems and precious stones, Aneka Ratana Manika Tisane Tiao, help set the theme, golden stones. A verse, heavily alliterative in Neva goes, quote, in the golden crown, a golden screw pine flower, on the ears, golden rings. Kanaka Matukasa, Kanaka Ketaki Swana, Karanasa Kanaka Kundala. Reminding the listener that just as the deity assembles jewelry, he is also a place of compassion, Karunanidhana, and is known by his name, Karunamaya, the compassionate. The Bodhisattva's jewelry is made out of nothing less than precious stones, just as the deity himself is made out of the purest substance a being possesses. Fashioning and material refer to each other just as the adorned and the adorning. Jewels are not celebratory add-ons, but lead the listener and are revealed to the listener to be one with the very essence and evanescence of him who is being celebrated. The Buddha is the jewel because he both rejects jewels and attracts and allows for more jewelry. These lyrics celebrate the symbolic and real capital that goes into the ornamentation of Buddhist or Hindu Neva devotional images. In fact, there's a whole branch of the Neva goldsmithing industry that produces jewelry which clients buy, not for themselves, but or to distribute within the family, but to gift to monasteries that hold charismatic images onto whom these donations are bestowed. There is a specific type of traditional Neva association, a guti, exclusively dedicated to the management of ornaments donated to a particular image, called the Tisa Bicha Puja Guti, association dedicated to worship involving the handing of jewelry. On particular days of worship, big festivals in the case of the most important images, more intimate events in the case of lesser known ones, the Guti members retrieve the jewelry from the temple custodian, report under his supervision damaged or missing pieces, make if necessary amends, cleanse, polish, and then return the objects to the image for worship. Images of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, of Vishnu, of Lakshmi, of Saraswati, all take gold and silver, gemstones, fashioned as crowns, earrings, necklaces, and anklets with specific iconographic features such as lotuses or tulsi leaves. Just as with humans, jewelry is not only made anew and donated, but made to remain with the deity and establishes continuity and a personal or familial relationship with the deity over time. Of the princely protagonists of the Avadanas, the story of past lives of the Buddhas who figure in lyrical and prose narratives and are regarded as extremely beautiful, more than one of these protagonists comes with a jewel embedded on the top of his skull, such as the beautiful prince Sundara Rajakumara Kavikumara, who, quote, had a crown jewel on his head and bore beautiful auspicious marks, end quote. The most famous throughout the Buddhist world is, of course, Prince Manichuda, literally one whose head crown bears a jewel, or of the eponymous Avadana. He, Prince Manichuda, figures so prominently in Neva literature that his story forms part of the corpus known as the Svayambhu Purana, a family of works of various scale, content, and time period that celebrate the Kathmandu Valley's most prominent Buddhist site, and that has been the story that has been integrated in the Manishaila Mahavadana, a Stala Purana, a Purana story celebrating a sacred site, celebrating the goddess Vajrayogini, worshipped in a temple above the Kathmandu Valley town of Sanku. The Neva language Manichuda Avadana Udrita is a standalone text derived from the version found in the Sanskrit Mahajatakamala, also preserved in Nepal, but also related to the one contained in the Avadana Kalpalata, another Sanskrit work. All versions include a passage that elaborates on the gem, mani or ratna, that emerges out of the prince's fontanelle and that gives him his name. This is not a jewel that is bestowed in order to beautify, but one that emerges from within and remains an integral part of the bodhisattva's body, right until the bitter end, when the decision by the prince to perform generosity, dana, involves it being surgically removed from his skull by two Brahmins. Consequently, its effect dramatically exceeds that of ordinary jewelry. The Manichuna Avadana Udrita, at variance with the Mahajata Kamala and closer to the other Sanskrit text, the Avadana Kalpalata, has the jewel emitting 1,000 rays of merit. Dolchi Punaya Tej Pihan Wasyanchon. The merit, Sanskrit punya, being, as the Avadana Kalpalata version explains, quote, carried over from a previous birth, end quote, and comparable to the light of the mental faculty of discrimination, viveka. In the Sanskrit, we find a trace of what Indologist Phyllis Granov has identified as the main quality of jewels in South Asian Buddhist literature, to allow for, quote, visions as expanded realities, end quote, with the jewel as a literary motive in which, quote, the deeds of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are either visible or actually manifested, end quote. In the Manichuna Vadana's narrative, the jewel's rays bore miraculous properties, such as turning warm what was cold, or cool what was hot, allaying famines, transmuting water into anti-venom, and silicons for the Avadana's plot, and iron into gold. In keeping with Granov's view that the jewel helps the deeds of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to be actually manifested, this ability for metallurgical upgrade works into the hands of the prince's inclination towards generosity, allowing him to perform at will the most upmarket instantiations of dana. An organically grown embodied jewel framed by a body that is not quite yet that of a Buddha, a jewel which is, as Granov so insightfully writes, quote, at once reflecting surface and creative matrix, end quote, produces the stuff jewelry is made of that can be gifted and worn. The jeweled world of the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and the world of jewelry of queens, kings, are one and many. It is the power that jewels hold, the setting in which they unfold it, and the connections the jewels are believed to establish that join these various realms into one. A key text of modernist Buddhism, in which this Neva poetic economy of jewels unfolds in old and new ways, is the Sugata Saurabha, a Mahakavya, a big, complex poem on the life of the Buddha, of Buddha Shakyamuni, composed by the most celebrated century Neva writer, Chittadhara There, lived 1906 till 1982. While in prison, he wrote the story with the Neva translation of the Lalita Vistara, an old hagiography of the Buddha, by Nishtananda Vajracharya from 1914 as his main inspiration. Jewels play in this poem a central role in celebrating the future Buddha's royal background, on the one hand, and on the other hand, his renunciation, consisting among other things in the rejection of ornamentation altogether. Jewels are introduced in the first canto, called Lumbini, in the entrance of Shakyamuni's mother and her female entourage, with a woman's, quote, gold anklets going cling-clang, chili-chili svarnagu gangala, quote, their nipples dancing like pearl necklaces, amigo nugale motimala sambutin, their hair and plaits decorated with flower gems, teeth of pearl in mouths of coral, emerald inlaid gold bracelets on both wrists, diamond-spangled earrings seen jiggling, to just name a few items of a very long list. Gautama's first rice feeding, his Machajanku, by contrast, is the first occasion on which the Bodhisattva displays his predilection for rejection. The poetic rendering of the rite sees his father, following Neva tradition, in having a dish placed in front of his son with objects which the infant is encouraged to touch, ritually determining his future professional career. This being a Neva text and the king wanting his son to be a prince, the reader is not surprised to find the dish filled almost exclusively with expensive jewelry. Bahumulya Bhushanaya Chulya. 3-faced amulets, lion-headed bracelets, a garland with mostly organic protective objects, but also hard to obtain heavenly jewels, a gold and pearl ringed Rudraksha garland, necklaces of white pearl, and top quality red-hued coral, Rakta Varnagu Binghuma. Anklets of gold, Lungya Goncha, gold ankle bells, Lungya Gangala, apart from, as de rigueur for this rite, among other things, a pen, a ball of clay, a brick, and a book. To the king's consternation, the Bodhisattva child grabs it all and flings it away. The canto called Marriage, Ihi, sees the next substantial ornament-heavy passage. It is artfully initiated in the preceding canto by the prince's first meeting with his future wife, and the gift, his travel chest being empty, of the ornament, the priceless necklace of his own beautiful neck. Just as in the Lalitavistara, the older version, the prince gifts his future bride a ring and more, which she there, however, refuses. Gautama's life as a Neva prince and householder begins as it shall end, by him getting rid of the entanglements of jewelry. The Bodhisattva then leaves behind him a trace of gems as he extricates himself from the life of desires that are not his. His famous chariot is decorated with gems, Ratnamaya. The Bodhisattva gives a pearl necklace, Mauktikama, as a farewell gift to his aunt, and foster mother who takes the gift as an expression of affection, Bhapa Premaya, just before the prince himself remembers the gift he gave to his wife as a vine of the heart, Hridaya Lata. The decisive act is, of course, the moment when the prince takes off his crown encrusted with precious stones, Bingu Mani Maya Mukuta, his pearl-embroidered shoes, Motimaya Lakam, and all other royal accoutrements. Asks his charioteer, Chandaka, to return all to the palace, and then uses his own jewel-crowned sword to cut off his hair. This step will be repeated by Yashodhara, his wife, in the next eponymous canto, who there decides to become a domestic yogini, Che Chona Na Yogini Teng, who teaches her female entourage the 5 precepts, including as part of the 7th of the 8 precepts, the Ashtashila, that they, quote, should vow to give up the wearing of jewelry and of all gem-studded ornaments. The women of the Neva court, whose excesses of ornamentation served as the show opener in the first canto, now turn the inner chambers of the royal palace into a jewel-free, semi-monastic space. One of the most visible motives of the whole first third of the poem, leading up to Gautama's great renunciation, is the celebration of beauty and wealth on the one hand, and its rejection on the other. The more breathtaking the jewelry, the more extraordinary the Bodhisattva's and his followers' abandonment. But there is more to it. Todd Lewis, another scholar of Neva Buddhism, has noted the excision of the supernatural in Chitta Hridaya's hagiography of Buddha Shakyamuni, and instead an attention to the realia of Neva heritage, such as the prince undergoing a life crisis rite and his wife a Neva wedding, all missing, of course, in the poem's old Sanskrit version. The degree to which jewelry and, of course, specifically Neva jewelry is celebrated throughout the first half of Sugata Saurabha is striking. I would take Lewis' point, however, a step further and suggest that the supernatural returns in the guise of a heightened poetic attention to a hyperbolically Nevarized ritual and material culture, to a legendary past in which the rich, the powerful, and the stunningly looking were all Nevars, and to a poetic utopia in which the world is beautiful and the good is possible. One needs to read this as stemming from the pen of a poet who was thrown to prison by a non-Neva political elite, who, while having themselves appropriated much of the Neva tangible heritage, suppressed the Neva people, their language, their literature, and their Buddhism. Opulence and renunciation are two sides of a Neva modernity born out of repression and resistance, and it's what utopian Buddhist poetry. Jewelry that is put on speaks of the rich, self-confident, unabashed, traditionalist Neva, while jewelry that is taken off holds the promise of individuals and of a society in charge of and not weighed down by their own wealth and their desires. Buddhist modernism, which among the Nevas comes in many forms, and particularly those associated with Theravada, stresses the renunciatory as a transformative, innovative, and liberating moment. Traditional Neva Buddhism, in which every desirable god or human comes with jewels, is poetically rethought and retraditionalized by giving jewels a new function that is both gendered, ethnic, and ethical. Jewels, embraced or renounced, allow the Neva Buddhist to be both authentic and renewed. Chittadhridaya also stands for an early 20th century modernist Nepalese Theravada-inspired Buddhism, still very much in the hands of men. Similar to the Neva songs, it is the man who imagines women wearing jewelry, the man rejecting it, and the women following his example. That changed in the second half of the 20th century when it is Theravada Neva women who begin having the greater impact on a changing Buddhist ritual world. To conclude, this paper has been about trying to understand the power that jewels have in their own right, which Buddhists and Buddhist texts plug into and derive their own respective power from. The power that empowers Buddhism and that empowers those who invoke Buddhism for their empowerment. For this reason, this talk has been primarily concerned with jewels that are worn by humans, real or imagined, jewels which through their use shape the differences that make up human relations, and by doing so mediate transformations in humans. Jewelry is the language of the unreal and unaffordable dear, of the affective that cannot be named otherwise, but by evoking the highest possible condensation of the precious. The jewels are left to do much of the talking, as much of the talking is done through jewels. And yet, in these contexts, although jewels have a power of their own and always do something, sparkle, shine, magically change and convey things, impact the observer, be she or he inside or outside the text, they are also never just thus. As we have seen, they are worn, owned, and they are gifted or rejected, always named, described, praised, desired, or given up. And it is in the rejection of the jewel that we experience not only the merging of him who takes note and her who displays, more importantly, the desired, which is the jewel, turns into the jewel that is the promise of an end to desire. Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Actually, I have one question.
Yes.
Did you ever meet any description of correspondence between precious stones and deities of Buddhist pantheon? Beside of Navgraha and Navratna, something related more to Buddhist deities?
Well, we have these songs which I mentioned where Buddhist deities are all described as wearing jewelry in a more generic sense, that they wear crowns and that they wear all the accoutrements which would come with, say, with royalty, for example. But you also have very, very kind of more specific forms of jewelry. Like, for example, you would have certain deities would prefer maybe not so much gold crowns, but they would prefer snakes wrapped around their arms and hands. Or they would prefer necklaces made out of skulls or so. So you have a whole different set or different repertoire of jewelry depending on whether you're dealing with wrathful gods or whether you're dealing with benign, more kind of royally representative deities, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and the rest. So yes, you have, and then for example you also have jewelry like, for example, the tulsi leaf jewelry, which is a more Vaishnava oriented form of jewelry, which you would find more on Hindu gods and Vaishnava oriented gods. You would not so much have specific stones going with specific gods. That I'm not aware of. It's more usually the combination which makes the specificity.
So you didn't find any text like Puranic literature would say that, for example, Shiva is associated with moonstone or pearls. There is nothing like this in Buddhism.
Not that I'm aware of, no, exactly. Yes. But thank you, that's a great question.
So where do we stand nowadays? Because if people in Nepal are changing with a changing economy and people are wearing less and less gold and more second or 22 or 16 karat gold, is that related to people's belief in religion that they're going to be a little bit further away from religious practices as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a difficult question. And I think there's no easy answer for that. Yeah. I would take a step back and ask how religious is traditional jewelry. I mean, and I think that would maybe open up the question to something also which I'm very interested in. I mean, say if you deal with jewelry related to gods, then the religious context is obvious. You're giving to gods, you're celebrating gods. Gods demand a certain kind of celebration and material culture. When you deal with jewelry, say used in life cycle rituals, what you get a lot is, and when you then ask, so what is this for? Why is she wearing silver? Why the collar is made out of silver? Why is the long soie made out of gold or so? Usually you get explanations which are not necessarily connected to the Buddha or the Bodhisattvas or gods. Usually these explanations, they are good for a certain purpose. They're good for protecting against a certain bit, like the prescription of the jeweler who says, elderly people should be wearing this kind of jewelry because it keeps them from feeling cold. For a trip, you might need the moonstone. So one may then ask, is this what kind of religion are we talking about here? It doesn't seem to be the religion of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Maybe another form of religion, if at all, is this religion. I mean, we could even see it as a kind of a science, of a science of materials, a science of, also connected to Ayurveda, that certain stones have a certain influence on one's bodily well-being, which again, Ayurveda is difficult, can be, but it's difficult to be, one can't really reduce it to religion. It does many other things as well. So I would say even traditional jewelry could be read as secular as modern jewelry, only it does different things. Say, for example, with traditional jewelry, I would say what it does, you get the traditional jewelry from your grandmother, for example. I mean, she hands it on to the next generation of girl children, and so you got, in the past, you got to wear your grandmother's jewelry, and this was basically the capital handed on from one generation to the next. That seems to be changing. I mean, those kind of things seem to be also changing. Not just the Ayurvedic scientific healing aspect, but also this kind of intergenerational link, if you so will, with these things being broken down. But also, however, I also say that by this old jewelry being broken up and made into new jewelry, there still is a certain link of sorts. But I'm not sure about the rupture in terms of whether the rupture can be marked in terms of religion, because the gifting to gods of jewelry to gods, that's not really changed. You wouldn't get Bengali style jewelry offered to Bungadyor or to some Papadyor. You would still get traditional Neva jewelry made there. Yeah. Or should also maybe relativize the modern jewelry side, because sorry if I go on, because this is a topic which interests myself a lot. Traditional jewelry now is more and more just borrowed. So you don't buy it, or you don't get it handed on for your grandmother. You go to shops where you can get that jewelry and just get it for that occasion, and then you pay something and then you give it back. So that's another way of dealing with jewelry, which one may or may not call religious if it's connected to religious performances.
First of all, thank you very much. You being a Westerner, you brilliantly made a presentation about the power and impact of jewelry in Neo-Buddhism. I'm a Neo-Buddhist also. So I would like to ask a question. Maybe it is out of, it is maybe not very relevant, but you being a Westerner, are there any similarities or dissimilarities? The power, the impact, or the role of jewelry in Neo-Buddhism and Western Christian culture. Yes. Do you find any, relevance, irrelevance, or in terms of all those things you said, the benefits of the stones,
Yes.
area. Their relevance in arts, in songs, you know. Is there any some kind of relevance in our culture or your Western, you know,
Yes.
Christian culture?
Yes.
The role of the jewelry.
Yes.
Just
Yes.
in you know, just observation.
Yes. Thank you so much. Fabulous question. I mean, marvelous question. I've been thinking about that myself a lot. Yes, I think the kind of changes I try to address in your question, I think you've seen them in other countries, and let me talk about Europe, yeah, let's just stick to Europe because that's my background, as well. So you have in Europe as well, but also one can say probably in global jewelry culture, there's a move away from precious stones and from the use of heavy deployment of precious stones to that less is more. And scholars have also looked at that change in Europe, that and have then also written about the fact that again in say pre-modern Europe a lot of religious but also healing aspects were connected to stones, and that stones are connected to the under. That you get that in as you're asking about Christianity a lot. Stones come from below the ground. So they come from a earthly, but also demonic, possibly, realm associated with hell and all kinds of dark powers. So, so the idea that through stones you can control people, you have power, and so on. This is very much also there in Christianity and in Christian influenced jewel culture. And there seemed to have been a rupture sometime in the 20th century where jewelry changes from having, from carrying its value through its stones, but rather by carrying its value through style and through fashioning. That jewelry is no longer at the centerpiece of the presentation of one's wealth, of the man's wealth and the woman's beauty in these traditional views. But it's more a question of taste. So not so much a question of money and of these dark powers possibly, but a question of the jewelry actually being almost a detail rather than the core of something. A detail which shows that this person has chosen wisely, and that this part actually talks about the character and the sense for beauty and the intelligence of the wearer. So that I would say is a shift which has happened from the pre-modern through modernity, where jewel design has become more important than the deployment of actually precious materials. That's how I would maybe start.
And let's take one more question. So I was really impressed at how much you have studied and done. But there are a few things that I don't know whether you came across or not. So the one thing which is most of the Bodhisattva and Buddhas believe they have a crown, right? It's called mukha. In mukha there is some kind of called kicking pan.
Yes.
So I don't know whether you have already mentioned in your study or not. So those kicking paths are very much familiar with the orange of our Buddhist people, and when they offer the kicking path to the God and goddesses. So those are the symbol of your history of family and also. So these things are also not included in your presentation. And also because of we have a Buddhi being already established by the King Mahendra at the time when the Buddhi Samsthan was established. What happened is the Buddhist Samsthan collected most of the data of all the jewelries offered to the god and goddesses everywhere. So from that time, the people have started offering less and less jewelry to the deities. So those things happen. Those are historical things we have come up with. So if you want to know the jewelry has been devoted or offered to the deities everywhere around the Kathmandu Valley, they are stored in a Buddhist Samsthan these days. So the Buddhist Samsthan not allowed to look at into every room. So these things are kind of very much interesting. If you are going to present this presentation around the world, so other scholars, so maybe we can do some protest or something that the Newar jewelry system, the Newar jewelry, the treasure of the Newar jewelry must be protected or maybe preserved somewhere in a museum or somewhere. So these things needs to be, I think, brought up by scholars like you are. So I think that will be very important for us to do the preservation so that the future generation might be interested to do more research and research on this. It's a very new topic for me to look at deep into all these things happening. So.
This is very, very valuable. Thank you so much. I wasn't aware of this fact and the impact of the Buddhist Sansthan on both the taking and the reduced donation and also to the deities. That's fascinating.
The Buddhist people must have to register all the jewelry which is being offered, and they have a list.
Yes. The Buddhists, yes, that's right. Yeah.
So that is very, one way it is unfortunate, for other way it is like a protective way. So protective way from getting stolen from other people.
That's right.
But I went to British Museum in London, and I saw a mukha, one of the very well-known mukha, and that mukha was labeled as the mukha should be worn by the Kumari. And when I look at that, it's not a Kumari, but somebody must have given the wrong information. And then the mukha should be worn by the Kumari. Kumari never wear a mukha.
Right.
So those things came up, so maybe this is for your information to go into this more detail.
Yes, thank you. But particularly what you said earlier also about the endangerment of these artifacts. I mean, that's something which will raise awareness there. I mean, that's.
So we are just talking about.
No, sorry, but thank you very much. It's very good, very good. Appreciate that.
Good. Okay. So thank you very much. Give a little.
Speak a little bit Newar to us.
Nyawa basan saka.
Spoke too much, I think.
Saka sa nyawa basan kalan desa.
Miroj, to them presentation Bidesam.
Thank you. So give a little pause, give a claps for him. Thank you.